If you're watching this hoping to survive a real winter crisis, hit subscribe now, because what you're about to hear could save your life when the power dies and the cold doesn't care about your plans. This isn't a story about magic or luck. It's about one woman's brutal wake-up call in the mountains and what she learned when the fire stopped working. The storm came in fast. I remember standing at the cabin window watching the sky turn that sick gray-yellow color that means the mountains are about to bury you. I'd been up here alone for 2 weeks already, working on some writing project that seemed important back when the roads were clear. The forecast said, cold snap. It didn't say the kind of cold that turns your breath to ice crystals before it leaves your mouth, the kind that makes the cabin timbers crack like rifle shots in the night. I had firewood. Lots of it. A whole winter's worth stacked against the north wall of the cabin, covered with a tarp I'd weighed down with rocks. I'd split most of it myself over the summer, felt proud of those calluses, the way my shoulders had gotten stronger. I thought I was prepared. I thought preparation meant quantity. The first night after the temperature dropped, I loaded the old stone fireplace the way I always did. Big logs, packed tight, door cracked open for airflow. The flames looked good, yellow and orange, dancing, making all the right crackling sounds. But 3 hours later, I was still wearing 2 sweaters and thermal pants, and I could see my breath inside the cabin. The thermometer on the wall read 7 degrees Celsius. 7. With a fire going, I fed it more wood, bigger pieces this time. The fire got louder, more aggressive, but the warmth didn't reach more than a meter from the hearth. By midnight, I was layered in every piece of clothing I'd brought, huddled so close to the fireplace that sparks were landing on my boots, and I was still shaking. The cabin's thin insulation couldn't hold what little heat the fire produced, and that heat was somehow wrong, weak, like trying to warm yourself with a candle. Morning came hard. I'd barely slept. The fire had died to coals sometime around 4, and I hadn't had the energy to get up and restart it. The inside of the windows were coated with ice, my breath, frozen and accumulated through the night. The water I'd left in a pot on the side table had a skin of ice on top. When I finally forced myself out of the sleeping bag I'd dragged down to the living room, my joints felt like they'd been stored in a freezer. Outside, the world had transformed into something hostile and indifferent. The temperature had dropped to minus 32 Celsius. The snow had crusted over with ice, and the wind wasn't just blowing, it was hunting, searching for any gap in your clothing, any exposed skin. I needed more wood from the stack. It took me 20 minutes to get properly dressed, layering everything I had, wrapping a scarf around my face until only my eyes showed. The journey to the woodpile was maybe 15 meters. It felt like kilometers. The wood under the tarp was frozen together. I had to pry logs apart, and when I did, I noticed something I'd been ignoring all along. The ends of the logs were dark, almost black. When I knocked 2 pieces together, they didn't make that sharp crack of dry wood. They made a dull thud, and they were heavy. Too heavy. I grabbed an armload anyway, my muscles screaming, my fingers already going numb despite the gloves, and stumbled back to the cabin. Inside, I loaded the fireplace again. This time, I really packed it, reasoning that more wood meant more heat. I got the fire started with newspaper and kindling, and the logs eventually caught. But as they burned, I started to see something I'd missed before. Steam. Not just a little whisper of vapor, thick clouds of steam pouring off the logs like I'd thrown them into a sauna. The fire hissed and sputtered. The flames couldn't get hot because they were spending all their energy boiling water out of the wood. I sat there, staring at that struggling fire, and something clicked. All that weight in the logs, that wasn't wood, that was water. The wood was wet. Not just damp from snow on the pile, but wet all the way through. Green. Unseasoned. I'd cut it and split it just months ago, and I'd assumed that was enough. I'd assumed that because it wasn't literally dripping, it was fine to burn. The thermometer still read 7 degrees, maybe 8 on a good hour. I was burning through my wood pile, making endless trips outside into air cold enough to kill me, and getting almost nothing for it. My hands were developing what looked like the early stages of frostbite. White patches on my fingertips that burned when I tried to warm them. My face was raw. Every breath hurt my lungs, and the cabin was barely warmer than a refrigerator. That second night, I didn't sleep at all. I fed the fire constantly, every hour, stumbling through the dark to add more logs, watching them hiss and steam and produce their weak, insufficient heat. I did the math in my head. I had maybe 3 weeks of wood left at this rate. The storm wasn't supposed to break for at least 2 weeks, and even then, the cold would linger. The road wouldn't be passable for a month, maybe more. I had enough food, barely. I had water from melting snow. But I didn't have heat. Not real heat. And without it, I would die up here, slowly, miserably, surrounded by cords of useless wet wood. By morning, I was beyond tired. I was hollowed out, running on something that wasn't quite energy and wasn't quite panic. But I was also thinking more clearly than I had in days. The problem wasn't that I was weak. It wasn't that I needed to work harder or burn more wood. The problem was that I was doing it wrong. All of it. The wood was wrong. The storage was wrong. The way I was burning it was wrong. And if I didn't fix it, none of the effort mattered. I forced myself to eat something, cold oatmeal because I couldn't spare the stove gas, and then I went to work. First, I needed to understand what I was dealing with. I'd heard about moisture content in wood before, read it in some article I'd half paid attention to. Dry wood was supposed to be around 20% moisture or less. Wood straight from a living tree could be 50, 60, even 70% water by weight. Burning wet wood wasn't just inefficient, it was almost pointless. The fire had to use most of its energy to boil off all that water before it could start burning the actual wood. And the heat from boiling water? That went straight up the chimney as steam, wasted, gone. I grabbed one of the logs I'd been burning and one from deeper in the pile that I hadn't touched yet. I didn't have a moisture meter, but I had logic. I took them both inside and set them near the dying fire, then I split them open with my hatchet. The wood I'd been burning was dark inside, almost wet-looking. When I pressed my thumbnail into it, it left a mark. The grain looked compressed, damp. The split pieces smelled sour, like rot just starting. I needed dry wood, but I didn't have months to wait for my pile to season. So I had to work with what I had and fix what I could fix. I started with the storage system. The tarp I'd used was keeping snow off the top, which was good, but it was also wrapped around the sides, trapping moisture inside the pile. Wood needs to breathe. It needs airflow, wind moving through the stack, carrying away the moisture that evaporates from the surface. I went outside again, and this time I didn't rush. I studied the wood pile like it was a puzzle I had to solve to survive, because it was. The bottom row was sitting directly on the ground, soaking up moisture from the frozen earth. The sides were sealed. The whole thing was basically a moisture trap. I'd built myself a humidor for firewood. The wind was vicious, cutting through my layers, making my eyes water and freeze. But I worked. I used some old pallets I found in a storage shed and created a raised platform, getting the wood up off the ground. Then I rebuilt the stack, smaller this time, in a crisscross pattern that left gaps for air to move through. I kept the tarp on top, angled so water would run off, but I left the sides completely open. My hands were screaming. My back felt like someone had taken a sledgehammer to it. But I kept going because the alternative was freezing to death while surrounded by wood. Next problem. The wood I had right now was too wet to burn efficiently, but I needed to burn something. I went through the pile piece by piece, looking for anything that might be drier. The smaller pieces, the ones that had been split into kindling size, felt lighter. More surface area meant faster drying. I gathered everything small, everything that had been exposed to sun and wind over the summer. It wasn't much, but it was something. Then I went inside and started a different kind of fire. Instead of packing the fireplace full, I used just the driest kindling and small splits, arranged loosely so air could flow between them. I got it burning hot, really hot, and kept it small and intense. The flames were different this time. Blue at the base, sharp and clean, no steam, no hissing. The wood crackled like it was supposed to, and I could feel the heat radiating outward, actually warming the air instead of just creating a bright light. But even this better fire wasn't enough. The old stone fireplace was beautiful, rustic, everything you want in a mountain cabin. It was also incredibly inefficient. Most of the heat was going straight up the chimney. The stone soaked up warmth and released it slowly, but not enough. I needed something that could capture the heat and hold it. I remembered something my grandfather had told me years ago, back when I'd visited him in his mountain cabin in the winter. He'd had a system, a masonry heater, he called it, though his was just a clever arrangement of the fireplace with thermal mass. The principle was simple. Burn wood, hot and fast, not slow and smoldering. Let the heat charge up a mass of stone or brick. Then the mass radiates heat for hours, long after the fire's gone out. But I didn't have a masonry heater. I had a drafty old fireplace. What I did have was a metal wood stove insert in the storage shed, left by the previous owner. I'd seen it when I'd grabbed the pallets. It was old, heavy, probably inefficient by modern standards, but it was still better than an open fireplace. Getting it installed in the middle of a storm, alone, weak from cold and lack of sleep, should have been impossible. But I'd reached that point where impossible stops meaning anything. You do it or you die. That's the only calculation that matters. It took me all day. The insert must have weighed 90 kilograms, and dragging it across the snow and ice was like trying to move a boulder uphill. I used rope, leverage, sheer desperation. I got it into position in front of the fireplace, connected the stovepipe to the chimney. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even close to perfect. But it was sealed. It had dampers I could control. It had baffles that would make the smoke and heat take a longer path before escaping, extracting more warmth in the process. By the time I got it working, it was dark again. I loaded it carefully with my driest wood, got the fire established, then closed the door. The stove ticked and pinged as the metal heated up. The firebox glowed orange through the gaps. And slowly, impossibly, the cabin started to warm. The thermometer climbed. 10 degrees, 12, 15. I didn't trust it at first. I thought maybe I was hallucinating, oxygen deprived from all the exertion. But no, the ice on the windows started to melt. The air stopped hurting to breathe. I could take off a layer, then another. For the first time in 3 days, I stopped shaking. I kept the fire burning through the night, but I didn't have to feed it constantly. The sealed stove held heat better than the open fireplace, and with the dampers adjusted properly, the wood burned hotter and slower, extracting more energy from every log. I woke up, actually slept and woke up, and the cabin was still warm. The thermometer read 18 degrees. Inside. During the coldest night of the storm. Over the next week, I refined the system. I moved my woodpile even further from the cabin, worried about moisture and insects, and I organized it by dryness. The wettest wood went to the back. The driest, what little there was, went to the front, ready to burn. I started splitting everything smaller. More surface area meant faster drying, and smaller pieces were easier to bring inside to finish drying by the stove. I kept a supply of wood in the cabin at all times, in a rack near the stove where the heat could drive out the last of the moisture. I learned to read the fire. A good fire in a well-tuned stove doesn't smoke much at all. The smoke should be almost invisible, just heat shimmer and carbon dioxide. If it's billowing gray or black, you're wasting fuel, creating creosote, getting minimal heat. I learned to load the stove for different situations. Quick heat when I first woke up. Small splits, arranged loosely, damper open. Overnight heat. Larger splits, packed tighter but not smothering each other, damper adjusted to burn slow but clean. The difference was staggering. On the worst night with the old system, the open fireplace and wet wood, the cabin had never gotten above 8 degrees. Now, with the insert and properly managed wood, I was maintaining 22 degrees, sometimes 25. The contrast felt like moving from a freezer to a living space. That jump, from dangerously cold to survivably warm, was my 30 to 45 degree moment. It wasn't a literal constant measurement, but it was the shocking difference between failing and succeeding, between using wet wood poorly and using dry wood efficiently. I used less wood, too. Maybe half as much. With the wet wood and open fireplace, I'd been going through an armload every 3 hours just to maintain that pathetic 7-degree temperature. Now, I was burning one good load every 6 to 8 hours and staying much warmer. The effort required dropped dramatically. I wasn't making constant trips outside, wasn't exhausting myself just to achieve inadequate results. The storm eventually broke, though the cold lingered for another 10 days. By then, I'd settled into a rhythm. I spent my mornings splitting and organizing wood, gradually working through the pile to increase surface area and speed drying. I kept the stove fed properly, hot fires, clean burns, no smoldering. The cabin stayed warm. My hands healed. I stopped waking up in the night shivering. I could think again, work again, exist as something other than a desperate animal just trying to survive until dawn. When the road finally cleared and I made my way back down to the valley, I didn't tell people I'd nearly frozen to death surrounded by firewood. I told them I'd learned something important. That preparation isn't just about quantity, it's about understanding the process. Wood isn't just wood. Dry wood at 20% moisture is fundamentally different from wet wood at 60%. The first gives you heat. The second gives you steam and frustration. Splitting wood isn't just about making pieces small enough to fit in the stove, it's about creating surface area for moisture to escape. Storing wood isn't just about keeping snow off the top, it's about allowing airflow through the stack, keeping it raised off the ground, letting the wind do the work of drying. And the fire itself, that's where everything comes together. You can have the driest wood in the world, but if you're burning it in an inefficient system, you're throwing heat away. Modern stoves and inserts, even older ones like the one I'd resurrected, are designed to burn hotter and cleaner than open fireplaces. They use baffles to make hot gases spend more time inside the firebox. Some use catalytic converters or secondary combustion systems to burn the smoke itself, extracting even more energy. Masonry heaters take it further. Short, intense fires that charge up hundreds of kilograms of brick or stone, which then radiate gentle heat for 12, 18, even 24 hours. The secret isn't strength. It isn't how hard you can work or how tough you are. The secret is understanding the system, the moisture content, the storage, the drying process, the combustion efficiency. Once you understand that, the work becomes easier and the results become exponentially better. That's not magic. That's just physics and chemistry working in your favor instead of against you. I spent the rest of that winter in the valley, but I went back to the cabin the next summer. This time, I prepared differently. I cut wood in late spring, split it all down to sizes that would dry quickly, and built a proper woodshed with a roof and open sides. I stacked the wood on pallets, kept it off the ground, arranged it so wind could move through the pile. By fall, I had wood that was actually ready to burn. I'd learned to check it, knock two pieces together and listen for that sharp crack of dry wood, look at the ends for cracks radiating from the center, feel the weight difference between wet and dry. That next winter, I stayed warm without struggle. The stove burned clean and hot. The cabin held heat. I used wood efficiently, and the wood pile lasted the entire season with plenty to spare. I slept through the night. I worked during the day. The cold outside was still brutal, still dangerous, but inside I'd created a space where it couldn't reach me. Not because I'd fought harder, but because I'd learned to work smarter. That's the lesson that saved my life and changed how I think about survival and preparedness. It's not about stockpiling without understanding. It's not about brute force when efficiency will work better. It's about asking why something isn't working and then fixing the root cause instead of just applying more effort to a broken system. Wet wood will never burn like dry wood, no matter how much you use. An open fireplace will never heat like a proper stove, no matter how big you build the fire. Understanding that difference, that's what kept me alive. So if you're planning to survive on wood heat, learn about moisture content, learn about storage, learn about efficient combustion. Get your wood split and stacked a full year before you plan to burn it. Keep it dry but ventilated. Use a system that actually captures heat instead of sending it all up the chimney. And if you take just one thing from this story, take this. The fire that saved my life wasn't bigger or stronger than the fires that were failing. It was smarter, and that made all the difference. If this story convinced you that efficiency beats brute force every time, subscribe right now, because understanding how things actually work is the only real survival skill that matters when everything else fails and you're alone with the cold.